All right, everyone, welcome to the ACOM seminar this week. Our speaker this week is Kevin DallaSanta from NASA Goddard, where he's in the postdoctoral program. Just a little background on Kevin. He got his bachelor's from St. Olaf College in Minnesota, and if you peruse his CV, he actually did some glaciology research. While he was at the college, he got his PhD in atmosphere and ocean sciences and mathematics from Krant Institute in New York with Ed Gerber, who's definitely one of those folks who places a big emphasis on a hierarchy of models for trying to develop a deeper understanding of the atmosphere. Kevin's PhD work really focused on stratospheric dynamics, especially the response of the stratosphere to volcanic forcings. And today, he's going to talk about dynamical and trace gas responses of the QBO to historical and future climate change. So Kevin, welcome to ACOM and take it away.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your inviting me to join you virtually. It's really a pleasure, and I look forward to the next opportunity to join in person and breathe the fresh Colorado air. So as Nick said, I'll be talking about some aspects of the quasi-biennial oscillation in terms of historical and future climate change. And as Nick said, I'm a little biased by my training and thinking of things in a hierarchical sort of way. So we have a couple different model configurations, which are fairly realistic on the realistic end of the spectrum, but give us illuminate some different aspects of these QBO changes. And we have some different forcings too, some idealized abrupt CO2 forcings, and then actual historical simulations. So I hope that there's some interesting aspects that you'll find today. So there we go. So just as a quick background, if you're not familiar with the quasi-biennial oscillation, there's no need to panic just yet. On the right, I've plotted the easterly and westerly winds in the tropical stratosphere. So this is like 30 degrees latitude in the southern hemisphere to 30 degrees in the northern hemisphere. And what you can see is that in the stratosphere, from about 100 hectopascals or 15 kilometers up to about 30 kilometers, there's this contrast between blue easterly winds and red westerly winds. And if you go about 7 months later, you see that those winds have descended a little bit. The easterlies have made their way further into the stratosphere. By 14 months, the westerlies are almost vanished and we just have easterlies. But as we go to 21 and 28 months, the westerly winds descend and the easterly winds reform on top. So if you take a time slice of this going straight through the equator, what you get is this on the bottom. You have bands of these red westerly winds and blue easterly winds descending. And the average period of that is about 28 months. So if you're not familiar with the QBO, it's important to note that the winds are descending, these contours, but the actual air molecules are not descending. On average, they're moving upwards through the Brewer-Dobson circulation. So it's specifically these values of the zonal wind that are going down. So this was discovered in the 1950s. The observational history is actually really interesting. People did balloon campaigns and then other incidental observations related to volcanoes and stuff. And that's discussed in the book by Levitsky and Van Loon. But the short story is that the QBO dynamics are fairly well understood. Momentum is deposited by waves, the easterly and westerly momentum. Those waves are both planetary waves and waves that are below the grid scale that have to be parameterized. Upwelling is also important in the QBO. So the QBO turns out to be really tricky to capture in climate models. As I said, some waves are resolved, your tropical waves and your planetary waves, while others, in particular gravity waves, have to be parameterized. There we go. So the QBO would just be kind of a curious stratospheric phenomenon, except that it's increasingly clear that the QBO's teleconnections are important. So there's some teleconnections that have been recognized to northern hemisphere extratropical winter, to stratospheric trace gases, obviously in situ. The QBO actually impacts predictability. So different phases of the QBO can make the atmosphere more or less predictable. There are teleconnections to the Madden-Julian Oscillation that are an active area of research, as well as some recent work showing that surface trace gases are connected to the QBO. So as I said, the QBO is highly parameterized, and not all models, in fact, represent it. So a multi-model initiative, the QBO Initiative, was launched in 2018 to kind of figure out what the current consensus is in terms of how well models capture the QBO, and then some key questions about how it might change in the future. So this would be, how is the period going to change, the 28 months that I showed before? Is the amplitude going to increase or decrease? Will it become more or less stable? So this was launched in 2018, and there's been a flurry already of papers looking at results from this multi-model study. Richter led a first study looking at QBO period and amplitude changes, and this was with 11 models looking specifically at the response to increases in CO2. So in the gray box is pre-industrial control, in the blue is doubled CO2, and the red is quadrupled CO2. And basically, for QBO amplitude, all of the models showed a decrease in response to extra CO2. So this seems to be fairly robust, both in the QBO Initiative and consistent with some previous studies in the literature. However, the period response was a bit more mixed among models. So some models had an increasing period, some have a decreasing period, and others have more or less the same period with large error bars. To kind of further complicate the matter, most of these models did not have interactive ozone, and only 4 of them had gravity wave drag connected to convection. So when you add gravity waves to your model, which are below the vertical resolution, you can have a fixed source of gravity waves, which is the most common choice. I think 6 of these models do. And then you can also have convective sourcing of gravity waves. So you say, well, when there's convection, that's going to excite some gravity waves that propagate upward. Let's build our parameterization around that idea. So again, only 4 of the models had that. And also the impact of SST feedbacks was not completely clear from this study. So Yaga and co-authors commented that to get more confidence in the future changes to the QBO, will require a more in-depth analysis of the processes that drive those changes. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, using some work that we did with a single model. The work doesn't obviously fully explain what will happen in the future, but it sheds some insight maybe into how the dynamics work. So I'm at NASA GISS, and our current high top model is model E2.2. So this is a CMIP6 contributing model. It was not a member of the part 1 of the QBO Initiative, but we are joining the experiments in part 2. So this study kind of catches us up to speed, hopefully with the period and amplitude changes that Yaga and co-authors looked at. Model E2.2 performs particularly well in the stratosphere by design, and it has that convectively sourced gravity wave drag. So what that means is that when the climate changes in the future, then changes in convection will also show up in the QBO. So there's a pathway for SST feedbacks and convection to impact the QBO. So like I said, we'll build on the results of the QBO Initiative, and overall we're consistent, but we look a little more in depth into the roles played by composition feedbacks, SSTs, and sensitivity to model physics. So model E2.2 can be configured in a variety of versions, obviously similar to Wacom. We have a non-interactive configuration. So here composition is prescribed from the pre-industrial simulation, and you don't change ozone or anything when you increase CO2. And that's run with a coupled ocean. To make things a little bit more complex, we have a linearized ozone scheme. So the ozone equation of state is Taylor expanded with respect to a reference box profile, and that gives us a simplistic way for ozone to adjust in response to changes in climate. Then more complex yet, we have a fully interactive chemistry scheme called OMA, and here there's a variety of species and composition couplings that are represented. But because this is a little more expensive, we run it with specified SSTs. And some additional work and testing suggests this is not really too critical of a choice. So the SSTs are simply replaced by what we get from the non-interactive version. Finally, we have a non-interactive version that's run with fixed SSTs. So when we increase CO2, we keep the SSTs fixed to the pre-industrial NINT climatology. So both OMA and these fixed SSTs are running with the SSTs from NINT, but in fixed, we leave them at pre-industrial levels. We don't increase those as the CO2 changes. So I'll recap why those are important as I show the results. So first of all, I'll talk in more detail about the QBO response to abruptly increase CO2 with pre-industrial 2 times and 4 times. And I want to parse somewhat carefully what's going on with the period and amplitude, the role that ozone feedbacks play, and the changes that we see in composition. And then we'll apply those kind of idealized results to the historical and SSP simulations. Obviously now the period and amplitude are trends. They involve other things going on in the background. And there's some interesting results on disruptions, which I'll talk briefly about. Finally, I'll talk a bit about the QBO response to volcanic eruptions in the model. That work is in revision. The idealized CO2 results are published and the historical SSP results are in preparation. So I'll try and mix these together in a logical fashion. First, I'll talk about the QBO period changes. So on the right, I've plotted the QBO period for each of the 4 configurations with the pre-industrial in blue, 2 times CO2 in green, and 4 times CO2 in orange. And what you see overall is there's a decrease in QBO period for each of the configurations. You'll notice that the 3 configurations with the coupled ocean, the non-interactive, linearized ozone, and full chemistry have much larger period changes as compared to the fixed SST configuration. So when we fix the SSTs at pre-industrial levels, we get little to no QBO period change. Whereas the ones with the coupled ocean, it doesn't seem to be too critical what the chemistry is. You still get a similar percentage decrease in QBO period. For the non-interactive, we tune that to agree well with reanalysis. So the QBO period, because of this convective sourcing of gravity wave drag, that QBO period is linked to convection. And that's been explored in some papers by David Rind, including his original 1988 parameterization. But as I mentioned, the QBO Initiative models don't have a consensus about future period changes, even if we only can consider models that have a convectively sourced drag similar to ours. So we look at that convection period link in a little bit more detail. The period changes are tethered to this parameterization of convection, and that increase in convection generates an increased momentum flux. So we move more momentum from the troposphere up and break in the stratosphere, and that allows the QBO to descend more quickly. So what convection looks like is shown on the right. These are the momentum fluxes due to convection for the pre-industrial controls in the top row. And you see they look similar for all the configurations. Then when we increase CO2, we get stronger convection, particularly over the Central Pacific. And the spatial pattern is kind of complex, but you see it looks really similar among these 3 coupled ocean runs. But when we fix SSTs, don't allow them to respond to climate change, we get little to no change of convection. So this is consistent with the lack of period change in the fixed SSTs and the very similar period changes among the 3 coupled ocean configurations. So we build on that with some further insight, looking kind of the seasonal details and the momentum budget, and the story stays the same. These period changes, the decrease in period is tightly linked to the parameterized convection in our model. Next, I'll talk about the QBO amplitude changes. As a first step, we use a single scalar metric for amplitude. We use an EOF-based measure, and if you're not familiar with EOFs, you can just think of this as a vertical average between 10 and 100 hectopascals, which is about 15 to 30 kilometers. So averaging through over the stratosphere and the QBO region, we come up with a single scalar in meters per second that represents the quote QBO amplitude. So again, there's a decrease in QBO amplitude in response to these increases in CO2. This time, the fixed SST really has a similar decrease of amplitude, so it doesn't appear that the SSTs are really critical for getting your amplitude changes right. There's a couple interesting features here, though. One is that when we move from the non-interactive chemistry to the linearized ozone and fully interactive chemistry, we see that the control period changes. The blue bars get higher here. And that is consistent with previous work. Neil Butchart showed in 2003 that ozone feedbacks act to increase the QBO amplitude. But we also find that the amplitude response itself is modulated by ozone feedbacks. So you have a very slight, barely significant decrease of amplitude in the OMA fully active chemistry, a little more in the linearized ozone, but really not as much as we see in the non-interactive simulations. So there's kind of a second order response played by interactive ozone here. So these are just simple scalars trying to measure the QBO amplitude. But when we look into the details, the story actually gets a little bit more complex. So I'll try and walk through those in a logical fashion. On the left column here, I've plotted the easterly amplitude of the QBO. So moving from the lower stratosphere up to about 10 hectopascals, the QBO easterlies reach about 40 meters per second in both the model and in the reanalysis. For westerlies, they reach about 20 meters per second, and they decay about to zero at the lower part of the stratosphere. So that's for the pre-industrial control. And we can plot the ratio of 2 times CO2 to the pre-industrial control, and same for 4 times CO2 to the pre-industrial control. So here's 1, no change, and we have a decrease in the QBO easterlies. And you'll notice that decrease is not uniform. It's not like every level is 80% of its previous value. We have kind of a peak here around, say, 50 to 70 hectopascals, where most of the change is taking place. And then further up in the stratosphere, the easterlies really aren't changing that much. For the westerlies, again, the upper stratosphere is not changing very much, but the change asymptotes as we approach these zero winds at the lowermost stratosphere. So there's kind of an asymmetry between the westerlies and the easterlies, and it's really not uniform in the vertical. So to understand that a little better, the QBO can be related to upwelling. As I mentioned, it's well appreciated that the QBO amplitude changes involve tropical upwelling. So I'll plot that here for the pre-industrial control. And then again, the ratio of 2 times and in 4 times. And an interesting thing here is there's a kind of a bulge in the mid stratosphere of upwelling change. And then there's this sort of response in the lowermost stratosphere. So 4 times, again, it's kind of a bulge in the mid stratosphere, and then really strong increases in lower stratospheric upwelling. So if I can point you to the legend here, the gold color is for the fixed SST simulations. So with fixed SSTs, we get very little upwelling change at the lowermost stratosphere, but we do kind of get that bulge. Whereas the simulations with coupled oceans all have this lower stratospheric upwelling increase, but more variation in how much of a bulge they get. Now, if we go back to the westerly amplitude changes, we see that for the gold fixed SST simulations, there's really no decrease in QBO amplitude. And it's interesting that the other 3 lines line up really well, just as the upwelling changes here agree very well, whereas we have hardly any change at the lowermost stratosphere in upwelling and hardly any change in the westerlies. For the easterlies, on the other hand, we have a response in all of them, strongest for black, then maybe gold, purple, and red. And when for the easterlies here, you can argue that the black is maybe the strongest, and then the gold, then the red, and the purple. So there seems to be kind of a correlation between the mid-stratospheric bulge and the upwelling increase and what's going on in the easterlies. And obviously this is, there's not a causation. It would be kind of difficult to prescribe the upwelling changes in a climate change experiment. But nevertheless, there are these kind of asymmetries that perhaps are linked, and they seem to be non-uniform in the vertical. So looking at the details helps us maybe understand why the amplitude decreases are larger for the coupled ocean configurations as opposed to the fixed configurations, and maybe how upwelling is involved in those. Lastly, to understand what's going on with the ozone response, I mentioned that ozone was a negative feedback on the period or on the amplitude response. It kind of buffered the QBO amplitude in response to climate change. So it's well known that ozone will decrease in the lower stratosphere in the future, and it will increase. In this model, the future increase is above about 20 hectopascals. It's getting stronger, getting more ozone at 4 times CO2 and less ozone below. So what that does is it creates temperature anomaly. You have more heating here, which can be expected to make the atmosphere a little bit more stable in the mid-stratosphere. So we might expect a priori that the upwelling changes would be suppressed in the Linus and OMA, the purple and red configurations, as opposed to the other 2 configurations. And that's indeed what we find. This mid-stratospheric upwelling is somewhat suppressed for red and purple as compared to the bulge that we saw for the fixed in gold and the non-interactive in black. So our general takeaway here is that there's a link between the mid versus lower and the westerlies versus easterlies, and the ozone seems to play a role specifically for this limited part of the easterlies. So it tempers the easterly response in a very narrow part. Obviously, this is somewhat specific to our model, but we discuss in the paper maybe some of how these implications might be more relevant for other parameterizations. Lastly, for part 1, I'll talk about the tracer QBOs and their changes in response to CO2. So the QBO has a signature in zonal wind and temperature, but also obviously in composition. So when we increase CO2 from pre-industrial to 4 times, we see some time average changes in ozone, for example, but we also see changes in the composited QBO. So these are the anomalies of ozone for the pre-industrial control and 4 times. And it's remarkable that we get such similar results with Linus and OMA, showing that the linearized scheme behaves well. The changes to those tracer QBOs are fairly consistent with their existing gradients. There's nothing too funky going on, except however for water vapor. You'll notice that water vapor has very little vertical gradient, so advection doesn't do very much. And obviously water vapor is dominated by the tropical tape recorder. So these QBO composites are moving up rather than moving down. However, I've snuck in here a nonlinear color bar because the changes in ozone or in water vapor are relatively small compared to the background, whereas ozone, they were closer to the same order of magnitude. So let me zoom in on that a little bit. The time average here is about 5 parts per milливol, tropical average. But when we look at the QBO composite, it's very small, maybe 100 times smaller. As I mentioned, the tropical tape recorder dominates in the stratosphere. And there was an interesting study that Marv Geller and colleagues did in 2002. They were looking at observations, so just a simple time series, and they saw a QBO signal in water vapor, but they noticed it seemed to be modulated by the ENSO cycle, so stronger at certain times and weaker at other times. And they conjectured that over a sufficiently long record, ENSO variability could swap out the QBO composite, so that looking month to month, you might see the QBO, but over a long average, like we've done here, that you would not see the water vapor signal. So we can look at that a little bit more quantitatively by comparing the annual. In the Fourier transform, we have the annual peak, the QBO peak, and then this kind of ENSO variability at higher periods. So at 100 hectopascals, the QBO is clearly higher than ENSO, and that's the bright red here. But when we go up to 20 or 5 hectopascals, really the QBO is no different than the ENSO variability. And that's what's happening here. When you get up to 5 or 20, there's hardly any QBO signature left, barely statistically significant if we were to run a test. And so our integrations pretty much validate the hypothesis that Marv Geller and his colleagues had. So these are the the kind of more idealized results of abrupt increases in CO2. I'll just recap them really quick and then discuss how they're applied in the more sophisticated forcings. So the QBO has a shorter period that we found for our model and a lower amplitude with increased CO2. And those seem to be really closely linked to convection and upwelling, at least in terms of how our parameterization behaves. So the convection trends appear to be really key, but as I mentioned, they're not captured by 7 out of the 11 QBO Initiative models. A lot of them have fixed gravity wave drag. The ozone feedbacks act to buffer the amplitude response, and seems like looking more carefully at the vertical structure and these easterlies versus westerlies may provide some insight into the intermodal spread. So next I'll apply these forcings to the historical and SSP simulations. Obviously they're non-stationary, so the picture could be different, but the short answer is the picture is consistent. So I'll move from abrupt CO2 to historical integrations. So here I plotted for one ensemble, the QBO period in blue, and then 1 over the momentum flux in blue. So this is 1 over convection proportional to the period. So this is one configuration I'll focus on first. We basically see that there's really no period trend from 1875 to present. And similarly, there's really no trend in tropical convection. You'll notice there is some low frequency variability, and it's kind of correlated. Maybe some of the bumps in convection are associated with increases in period. Now, if we look at QBO amplitude, it's obviously kind of noisy, but it's fairly flat until about the 60s, maybe when ozone depletion kicks in. And then we get a decrease in QBO amplitude. And here I plotted tropical upwelling with a reverse axis. So tropical upwelling is quite flat for the ensemble until the 60s, and then tropical upwelling starts to increase, going down on this plot to stay parallel to the QBO amplitude changes. So this is just for one ensemble. It's the non-interactive ensemble or non-interactive configuration I showed before. But we have a similar ensemble with a slightly different physics package, altered physics versus standard physics. And it basically gives us a check on whether or not these results are robust to technical changes in the model. And again, we see little period trend, more of an amplitude trend kicking in the later part of the 20th century and parallel to proportional to the upwelling changes. And we find similar results for, we have some interactive chemistry configurations with AMIP style specified SSTs, and with ocean, this same story keeps coming back. So this is kind of the historical retrospective, seemed consistent with our abrupt CO2 studies, but really pointing to a role of ozone depletion, which is related to changes in upwelling. We can do a similar analysis for the SSP period and amplitude. So here I plotted 4 SSPs, 1 to 6, all the way to 585. And the QBO period seems to decrease in the future, maybe leveling out under lighter emission scenarios, but a little bit stronger as we go to stronger SSP forcings. The QBO amplitude is fairly flat for the lighter SSPs, but the amplitude decrease is stronger for the stronger SSPs. And I haven't shown the upwelling and convection plots, but those are proportional, just as we found before. So it is somewhat reassuring that in a more complex forcing, the historical or the SSPs, that we really recover the same results and mechanisms that we did in the abrupt CO2 forcings. A second aspect of the historical forcings that turned out to be really interesting was disruptions. So we have these ensembles that are run for long historical forcings or long SSPs, and we see sometimes that the QBO is kind of perturbed or disrupted. So we developed a stability index for how that works. Basically, 1 in the stability index corresponds to a pure perfect QBO. And as the QBO is disrupted, there's a kind of a fairly rapid dip down towards half or all the way to 0. And at some point, the QBO always recovers in our simulations. And those correspond to anomalies in zonal wind. So here you can tell the QBO is kind of fuzzing out after the eruption of Pinatubo. And around 1993 in this member, there's almost a quadrupole structure with red, blue, and that's not QBO-like at all. So that's why we get this dip in our stability index. And what we can do is when we notice there's a dip in the stability index, we can look at the momentum budget more carefully to figure out, what went on. Why did the QBO get messed up? And in this case, there was some westerly forcing by advection, thanks to the aerosols from Pinatubo. And those really killed the easterly branch descending here. Then the easterly branch is messed up, the westerly branch is messed up, everything kind of broke loose until it reformed. So this is useful for long integrations where it's hard to manually tabulate what's going on with the QBO. And it's nice because it's a secular index. So if the QBO is partially disrupted in some sense, we don't have to make that call. You just see it from this line plot. So next I'll show this stability index for all of the forcings and all of the members that we have. So here again, 1 means a perfect undisrupted QBO. And as we get down to 0, that means there's some disruption. So from the abrupt CO2 results, it really looks like the pre-industrial 2 times and 4 times members really have about the same stability. There's not a really clear statistically significant decrease. Same thing in the SSP integrations. There's maybe a hint, the red and green showing us more disruptions with the stronger SSPs, but it seems that our model is fairly robust to the SSP forcings. The QBO isn't breaking down in a dramatic fashion. However, for the historical integrations, it does kind of look like these disruptions are getting more frequent for different members later on in the record. But when we started to look into the details, the story got a little bit more complex. It's hard because we don't have a lot of validation from reanalysis. There's really only 1 QBO disruption in 2015-16, and MERA2 shows something funky in 1988 that's not seen in E-ray interim. So we don't have a lot of historical ground truth or air truth, as it were, to compare. And then some additional experiments really suggest there was some link to time-varying volcanic aerosols. So this is about when Krakatoa occurred. You have, this is actually a few years after Nova Erupta, so it's not clear that those 2 are necessarily linked. But then post-Pinatubo, there's all this activity. Obviously, Pinatubo was short-lived, but there is something funny happening after this. So at this moment, the idea is there's something going on with the way aerosols and the QBO are interacting, but this is very much work in progress to try and understand what sets these historical disruptions in order that we can explain why we're not seeing the corresponding disruptions in the abrupt CO2 and SSPs, because the SSPs in the abrupt CO2 are forced with time constant aerosols. Again, work in progress, but this secular index for QBO stability seems to be very helpful in pointing us where to look. So the main summary from the second point is that the relationships from the first section also hold for the historical and SSP trends. Period and convection, decreasing in the future, and amplitude, decreasing in the future linked to the upwelling change. So I'll talk lastly about the QBO response to volcanic eruptions, and then there should be some time for questions after that. So it's a natural question to ask how the QBO responds to large volcanic eruptions. Not much happens in the tropical stratosphere. From a dynamics point of view, you have upwelling, I guess, the BDC, and volcanic eruptions, the QBO. But that's, I mean, then we get into composition, right? The other things that happen in the tropical stratosphere. So it is a fairly first order question to ask. And some work has looked at geoengineering and the interaction with the QBO, and also supervolcanoes when you get a really strong forcing. But less work has been done on some more common amplitudes, like those that are seen in the historical record. So Krakatoa and Pinatubo are the 2, shall we say, moderate-sized eruptions, order of 10 teragrams sulfate since 1850. And when you have those eruptions, the volcanic aerosol leads to heating in the stratosphere. So you have shortwave heating from absorption of incoming solar radiation, and then that radiates long-wave heating, affects upwelling. Basically, you get a red blob as a result to the aerosol. So this is warming from the aerosols. And you'll notice that for Krakatoa, this member has a background temperature QBO. So we had cold, warm, and then cold. But that descending cold branch was interrupted by the warming from the volcanic aerosols, such that we really get kind of uniform warmth through the column. But when that member got to Pinatubo, we had warm, cold, and then a warm branch is when the Pinatubo eruption occurred. So instead of interrupting the cold branch, we get a super strong warm branch of the QBO. So you can think of this background QBO being superimposed to first order with the volcanic forcing. They're kind of commingled. Obviously, the interaction is nonlinear. The effect of that, of these warm anomalies, is to bias the QBO towards a westerly state. So these westerly zonal winds are associated with warm temperatures, and the easterly zonal winds are associated with cold temperatures. So to keep things simple, basically you have heating here, and that means the QBO likes to hang out in this westerly phase. If the QBO is in an easterly phase, the aerosol heating will prematurely end it, and you'll get these westerlies descend a lot quicker. You can kind of see that from this plot right here. When the easterly phase is interrupted, we get a quick red cycle before we return to blue. This is just like 1 year. But in Pinatubo, when it was initially in the westerly phase, we have almost, well over a year, almost 2 years of warm anomalies, and it even extends further at these lower levels. So the QBO would really like to hang out here after a volcano. To make that explanation a little bit more quantitative, what we can do is measure the length of the QBO periods immediately after Krakatoa and Pinatubo. So one member might start here when the Pinatubo or Krakatoa erupts. Another member might start here in any arbitrary phase corresponding to this composite that I plotted for reference. So what we see is basically what I tried to hand wave on the previous slide. When the QBO starts in a westerly phase, the period gets longer. These members are very happy to hang out in this phase for a little bit until the aerosols dissipate and things return to normal. However, when the eruptions take place in the easterly phase, when the easterlies are lower and the westerlies are just starting to descend on top, the QBO hurries down. The westerly branch zooms along, and we don't really savor the easterly phase. So the QBO period is shorter than average. You can see there's a little bit of a sinusoidal forcing for these different members. Doesn't really seem to be sensitive to the different configurations that I showed before. Interactive chemistry doesn't appear to be important, AMIP or interactive ocean. For Pinatubo, we get a similar feature. These members are increasing more and more. This member is actually like 55-month QBO period as compared to the climatology that I plotted in the bars. So then when we get to an easterly phase, there's a sudden decrease and maybe levels off a little bit, a little more of an increase. Merit2 is not super helpful for validation, but at least it falls along this line. So again, the main takeaway is that you have some climatological value. It's longer than that if you start off in a westerly phase of the eruption, shorter than that if you start off in an easterly phase. So that's QBO period in response to eruptions. Last, I'll talk about the QBO amplitude response to eruptions. So here I plotted the scalar metric that I used before to measure the QBO amplitude. So we're going along before Krakatoa, and then some of the ensembles have a decreased amplitude that recovers after a couple of years. Here the ensembles are the green, blue, and purple. But for Pinatubo, really only the green one decreases. And Merit2 in the black line does not show much of an amplitude decrease in response to the eruption. Now, this leads us to kind of not be super confident about any amplitude changes, because you notice that green, purple, and blue correspond to this altered physics, AP configuration, as opposed to the standard physics configuration. And as I mentioned before, that's kind of a quick check on how robust our results are with respect to some small technical changes in the model. So we don't really have a confident response in how the amplitude is changing. However, we do notice that the amplitude changes averaged over the 2 years in the y-axis are correlated with tropical upwelling over that time. So the stronger upwelling around 20 hectopascals is associated with a stronger QBO amplitude during that stretch. And it seems to be kind of similar for Pinatubo and Krakatoa. So the interpretation here is that when you have at a specific level some circulation anomaly, then that's related to the aerosol heating. And the strength of that seems to be proportional to the QBO amplitude during that time. And to really understand that, further study is needed with larger ensembles, which is what we're working on now. So to summarize this part, after a volcanic eruption, QBO prefers a westerly state because the red westerly zonal winds are associated with warm temperatures in QBO. And you can quantify this using the period response. Any amplitude weakening is inconclusive at this point. So we need to test some larger volcanic ensembles and also larger QBO amplitudes. I mentioned some work with geoengineering and super eruptions. And at some point you can get the QBO to shut down. So we really want to see how that works in our parameterization as compared to some other model results that have been shown in the past. Another ongoing work, as I mentioned, is these QBO disruptions. The story seems to be somewhat subtle, especially as the character of the disruptions is different. Some of them look more like the 2015, 2016 disruption with EP flux anomalies. Other QBO disruptions, like the one I showed, are more involved with volcanic forcing. So there's clearly a rich data set for us to parse. And that's above, I've included the main points from the previous sections. So I guess now is a good point to stop and we have some time for questions. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Kevin. All right, so we've got the Slido questions up. So if you have any questions, please enter them on Slido. They'll go through a moderation, so there'll be a little bit of a delay. There's also a delay on the live stream here. So
okay.
We'll probably, sometimes it takes a minute to get things going. So I actually wanted to ask a follow-up on the QBO disruption stuff. So I know I'm not gonna pretend like I totally understand the paper, but Peter Hitchcock had this paper on how you can get these QBO disruptions in a dry core, and it's got some sort of mechanism where there's a feedback between like easterly jets and sort of stationary wave forcing. So I'm wondering, I don't think the 2016 disruption, there was necessarily a volcanic kind of forcing present. So do you think generally like a lot of different things could function through that dynamical pathway, or do you think that this could be something slightly different?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as I mentioned, we're working from the other end by starting to look at the results and then trying to work backward towards the mechanisms, because there have been a lot of mechanisms proposed for what happened in 2015, what happened in 2020, what happens with Peter's model, whatever. But what we found so far is that the disruptions are really heterogeneous. So some of them are associated with changes to convection, some are associated with kind of random upwelling anomalies, some are associated with like changes in resolved wave divergence, so tropical waves or extratropical. And there doesn't seem to be really a clear way to unify them at this point. So yeah, we haven't really made it to the point of saying, we confirm Peter's model or we dismiss Peter, what I mean to say. So that's still very much work in progress, trying to work maybe from the other end of the tunnel. It is just nice though that our model does have some disruptions without shutting down completely. Whether or not that's physical, it does give us a data set to work with as compared to some other models.
Cool, yeah, that's great. So we've got a question from Bill. Excellent talk, thanks. This talk focused on the tropics, but have you looked to see any systematic changes and links to the extratropics or surface in your different simulations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Clara Ore has been leading some of the surface work, the coupling in the extratropics, and it does appear there's some interesting results there. We have done a little bit of investigation with related to QBO MJO teleconnections, but that is more difficult for a variety of reasons, including the MJO in this model. So we don't have any, I guess, major results at this point to present. But yeah, definitely a very active area of research, and an area that relies on, QBO surface coupling also involves the ENSO coupling. So you have QBO to ENSO to surface, and you kind of increase the dimensionality of the problem very fast. So yeah, work in progress. Thank you for the question.
Give it a second for any other questions to trickle in. Maybe another one. So I was really interested in this, the importance of the convection feedback, the importance of the convectively generated waves. So I feel like that sort of puts us in an interesting situation where some of these robust responses in the stratosphere depend on the particular nature of some small scale parameterization. So I'm sure it's one of those things where we should probably eventually do it, but it'll be a long way off. But are you aware of anyone looking at anything like this in like a, not a convection resolving model, but just like very high resolution, like nature run type simulations? Has anyone sort of looked at simulations that actually can resolve a lot of the spectrum of gravity waves and even look at the variability of the QBO and how these things relate?
Yeah, I know of a couple runs that have looked at the impact of high resolution. There was, I think, Kawatani, it led a couple of runs with Mirok at really high resolution, but I wouldn't say they get a lot of the gravity wave spectrum. Maybe you can get a semblance of the QBO that forms, but I don't think anyone has sat down with a 1 meter vertical grid and really tried to crank this out. I think more insight might come from observational work. I know there's work being done with some balloon data and gravity waves, and I think Joan Alexander has led some advances with satellite interpretation of gravity waves. So it may be possible that at least we can get a rough proportionality constant between convection and QBO momentum flux. Yeah, definitely a hot topic for sure.
All right, if anyone has any questions, we'll start the countdown timer. We'll give it maybe 30 seconds here.
Good. Yeah, and if anybody would like to ask more questions over email, please, or you can find my my paper, and I'm happy to discuss some of the work in progress. So please feel free to ping me.
I'll give it a little bit longer.
In a seminar room, everybody, always has the feeling that it's time to go, right? Yeah,
you don't get any sort of audience feedback. It's hard to judge.
I can hear the applause from here. Don't worry.
All right. Well, everyone, thanks for attending. Let's thank Kevin again.
Thank you, everyone.